Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this e-Memoir session. We're looking at using the adult education budget funding streams to develop and increase apprenticeship activity. We're joined by Beej, Kaczmarczyk. We like to keep these sessions as interactive as possible, so please feel free to use the question or chat facility. If we can't resolve any of the issues you've got right now, we're happy to take them beyond these webinars, and we're always happy to help. So keep the questions coming. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Beej.
Thank you, Manny. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, particularly to our subscribers and regular users of the e-Memoir web-based system. And this afternoon, over the next 50 to 55 minutes, as Manic says, the theme of this webinar will be how to make the best use of adult education budget funding streams to increase, grow, develop the apprenticeship activity that you might be involved in, or you might be involved in with your partners. I think it's appropriate maybe to sort of be looking at both of these key issues around the funding of adult education outside of apprenticeships and how that can feed into apprenticeship activity. We know for the next 5 or 6 weeks there'll be other things on our minds in terms of the election, but I know from listening to many of our partners, whether it be colleges, training providers, local authorities, we're all very keen to make sure that our business and curriculum planning for 17-18 is complete. I know in many cases now you've done your market analysis, you're looking at performance issues and you're identifying the things that you could be doing differently or better or more of. But also I think we've got some uncertainty still in the system. Those of us that are not colleges, that were involved in the procurement of adult education budget will not know what we're going to get or will get until the end of May. And obviously we've also got the uncertainty about the non-levy paying employers procurement that's affected almost all of us that have got apprenticeship provision until the end of December this year. So there's still some great uncertainties in the system. However, what I want to focus on this afternoon is something which I've done not only with Learning Curve Group, of which I'm a non-executive director, but also with other of our partners, is start to identify the best way to improve progression, access to apprenticeships through those other funding streams, such as, I know some of you have got 16 to 19 study program streams, which originally would have come through the Education Funding Agency, but obviously since those are now merged, that's with the Skills Funding Agency, we still have, of course, a different methodology for funding the activity known as 16 to 19 study programs. We've also done previously webinars on how advanced learning loans could be used to improve progression to apprenticeships. But today's brief is to look at what was traditionally called the Skills Funding Agency Adult Education Budget, is now the Education and Skills Funding Agency's Adult Education Budget, and how that can be used to identify opportunities for people who might be out of work or might be going through changes in their employment status in terms of accessing new jobs, new opportunities with training as apprentices, which is simply getting access to jobs in the first place if they're unemployed, particularly if you're working with European social funded projects, but also to see how other aspects of the adult education budget, such as access to the first level 2 entitlement, the first level 3 entitlement, the extended offer that's been possible this year under local flexibility, and also the crucial importance of English and maths as sometimes being barriers to adults accessing jobs and accessing jobs with training, and obviously how we can help to overcome those barriers. So it's very much about how the adult education budget can be used in that way to get people into jobs, and particularly get people into jobs with training, preferably apprenticeships. So for those of you that, and I know from the questions that we posed to you, some of you have come back to us, thanks colleagues from some independent training providers who said that we haven't got an adult education budget contract yet, but are working as subcontractors or would be keen to be a subcontractor, particularly in areas such as pre-apprenticeships, employability skills and traineeships, but also thanks to the responses from Leeds College of Building, South Devon, one of our partners, and from West Notts. So what is the adult education budget? For those of us that have got allocations, we know that that's a single line budget that replaced what used to be called the further education budget for adults outside of apprenticeships. But it now includes community learning, which still is accounted for separately. Some of that was formula funded and some non-formula funded, as well as discretionary learner support, which you'll be familiar with in terms of help with bursaries, help with childcare and hardship funds. The whole of the adult education budget outside, obviously, clearly of apprenticeships has been set at £1.5 billion, and that's for the year that's just gone by, the one that we're in, but also that's in the indicative budget for next year, and it's likely that that will be the case up until the end of 2020. But of course, it did say originally up to the end of this Parliament, and of course that was yesterday. So things could change. One key thing to be aware of, particularly if you're new to the adult education budget, is that from the Education and Skills Funding Agency's point of view, we try and apply 3 principles to allocating the adult education budget. One obviously is to make sure it's effectively used to deal with key issues such as low levels of literacy and numeracy, the skills gaps, unemployment, getting people into jobs, but also improving productivity. It's got to be simple so that all users, including employers, including those people who are going to pay a contribution of 50%, or those who are going to be taking out loans, for example, the Advanced Learner Loans Facility, understand the process, understand how it's calculated, and obviously for you it's got to be critical that you understand what is a viable group size and how the revenue comes into your institution, where you be grant funded or contract funded. But I think a third feature, and which I'm going to focus on separately, is the importance of localization, and that clearly links with things like how are you working with your local enterprise partnership, your combined authority, and any other agencies to, for example, address employment gaps, particularly where there are significant mismatches in the labour market between the supply of labour and the demand for labour, where there are skills gaps, particularly for help with those people who have got low levels of English and maths and not got the employability experience, to make sure that they are equipped to go into those jobs. And that clearly links up, therefore, with employment and the training that comes with employment. But I think it's also important to realise that the adult education budget is not just for those skills acquisitions, those first level 2s, those first level 3s. It's also funding a broader range of activities which in many cases are not leading to recognised qualifications or regulated qualifications. Now that could be community-based learning, where you're accessing those that are furthest away from learning, that need maybe some kind of pre-access programs, engaging with those adults that have been out of the labour market or out of learning, with those people with independent living skills, and also increasingly across all of those different streams, employability skills. So you can see that the adult education budget itself is preparation for further study, preparation for employment, preparation for obviously apprenticeships. It's also critical to realise that the adult education budget is being used as match funding for European Social Fund projects, whether they be for the youth, support for unemployed, which we've talked a bit about so far, or support for development of the workforce. So again, quite a lot of the access and progression to employment and to apprenticeships is being achieved through adult education budget being matched to European Social Fund projects. And I think that's a critical aspect. And I know that some of those of you listening in, you've got very specific targets there for progression, particularly to employment. The other thing to note, and I said that was one of the key principles, was that increasingly the adult education budget will be subject to local devolution of funding and commissioning, and that might be by the LEP or by a combined authority or by some other arrangement. That's going to apply to many of us after 2018-19. Those of you listening in from London, it's going to be maybe a year later when we have that comprehensive devolution of the adult education budget. And I'll come back to that as a key aspect, because that links very much with meeting the needs of the local labour market, and particularly getting people into jobs that haven't got jobs, but making sure that they also stay in employment, and in particularly there, the importance of training and apprenticeships. So what does the actual adult education budget fund? It funds the following types of training and education: statutory entitlements, which I'll look at. That's your entitlement to the first level 2 qualification, the first level 3. and those are all very much qualifications that you'll see details of on the hub. The skills provision for the unemployed, which we've talked a wee bit about, and how important that is, particularly through the local devolution deals. Traineeships, which is a very, very directed and clear route into apprenticeships, which I want to look at. Although one of the things that, certainly from your comments, and thanks very much for the feedback, is adult traineeships do not seem to have been particularly popular, and even where you've run them, the progression to apprenticeships has not been very good. As well as the wider community learning, which I think you mustn't lose sight of, is often the first steps back into learning by a lot of adults, and also those adults particularly who have been furthest away from experience of learning. Those funds will fund the activity, whether it be qualification bearing or non-qualification bearing, but also it's there from the point of view of non-formula funding to support those learners with individual needs in terms of learning difficulties or disabilities, learning support, and also learner support, including, as I said, hardship, childcare and residential cost. Now, underpinning all of this is the assumption that the adult is eligible to be funded, and those rules are exactly the same as we've always had, as well as that the program that they're doing is eligible to be funded. So those two conditions still apply. Now, there have been some, although the formula and the way the adult education budget works and what it funds is not changed significantly from 17 to 18, there are some things you should be aware of. The first thing is, traditionally, quite a lot of you, particularly if you were colleges or large training, independent training providers, you'd have had students who were actually 16 to 18 when they started the program, who would have been funded by the EFA, the Education Funding Agency. Because they turned 19, actually were then switched over to the SFA, and therefore were part of your adult education budget allocation, if you were grant funded, or obviously if you were contracted to be part of your contract. Well, from August of this year, those students will continue to be funded as if they were 16 to 19, and therefore won't be that part of your adult education budget allocation. So you'll find that your adult education budget will go down, but those of you who have got a 16 to 19 allocation, that should go up. There are some changes to statutory entitlements. Now, these are linked to local flexibility, so they won't always apply across the country or to all groups of learners, and I'll come back to those. The most important of those, I think, is that any entry level and level 1 learners who are particularly doing programs that will then give them access to a level 2 or a level 3 outcome, or to improve their English and maths, or to get into a job, and preferably a job with the, apprenticeships, then those are some of the changes there. I think one point to note, by the way, that in terms of the community learning program, some of that is now moving over to being what we call formula funded. So the outcomes we'll be looking for is the achievement of qualifications. If we're not using regulated qualifications, then the learning, the outcomes could be measured in terms of RARPA, so there's some system for recognizing any achievements which are not necessarily leading to qualifications. Now, that might be through milestones, what people can do, which they didn't do before, or parts of qualifications which you can extract, maybe at unit level, whatever. In some cases, by the way, it could be that you're just giving the person access to a program that might lead to a qualification. So the outcome there would be, I did this non-qualification program of, say, 30 hours. It built my confidence up, and therefore I can now go to maybe an award or a certificate, and therefore that would be seen as a key outcome. The other outcomes could be, of course, in terms of employability, into employment, and obviously into further training. So a good question there for Ian. Thanks very much for that. But also you can talk about things like community engagement, for example, where previous communities might not have had high levels of engagement with the social services or with other aspects of local provision, housing, for example, then you can find that there are softer outcomes as well, as long as clearly these can be in some way measured. One other point to note is that previously we were able to via funds between 16 to 18 apprenticeships and traineeships. That's not going to be permitted from the beginning of May, clearly because we've got a new apprenticeship funding system. But one thing I want to come back to, and it's a question that already one of you has posed, can I use an adult education budget allocation to fund 16 to 18 traineeships. That's 16 to 18-year-olds who want to do a traineeship. And the answer is yes. If you've already got an adult education budget allocation or contract, then clearly you can do that. And I'll come back to that later on. One other point to note, again, one of you has asked, offenders in custody are no longer the responsibility, and there's very little reference to them in the funding documents now, because that's all resting with the Ministry of Justice. And in response to our colleagues at Premier Care, the rules on subcontracting, which are in the funding guidance that you've had, the draft version of the funding guidance of 1718, indicate that there are no significant changes to subcontracting rules. So, for example, the minimum, if you've got a value of activity of more than £100,000, then you've obviously clearly got to be on the register of training organisations, and obviously all the other rules that apply in terms of setting up subcontracting, who you should subcontract with, the distribution of income, monitoring, quality assurance, all those things stay the same. And obviously subcontracting is still an important aspect of the way in which we activate some of those markets that's a bit more difficult for us to activate, such as, for example, adults who have been in some way distanced from learning. One thing I think that maybe we haven't understood, and this is maybe because of the previous way in which a lot of the adult education, what was called the adult skills budget, was allocated and managed, is that there is a degree of freedom to deliver activities now which could include qualifications, but not necessarily. And I think that's something maybe that might be useful, particularly if we're working with disadvantaged communities, people that have been out of the labour market, is to design programs where the outcomes could be broader, as Ian said, than simply qualifications. However, for legal entitlements, the first level 2 or the first level 3 for 19 up to 23-year-olds, don't forget the rules here are what is the age of the person at the beginning of the program. Then obviously, and in addition to that, English and maths for anyone who's age over 19 or he hasn't achieved a grade 4 or at least a C in GCSE, then these programs will continue to be fully funded. So the second issue for those of you that is, first of all, can we get into the adult education budget? Yes, if you go through the procurement exercise or if you're a subcontractor that can guarantee quality. Secondly, is what is it that you can deliver? And obviously fully funded provision is the first level 2, the first level 3 English and maths. They're fully funded, and therefore we're removing one of the barriers, which is the contribution that the learner will make or will be required to make. But with the ESFA now saying it will also fund fully any 19 to 23-year-olds who maybe have already got a full level 2 but need to do another level 2 because, for example, they might have done a catering diploma, now they're thinking of moving into engineering. Why? Because there are jobs in engineering, as long as they're unemployed. Otherwise, they'd be co-funded. So then, in other words, these learners would be fully funded, and so if the program was worth £1,000, then you would not be asking the learner to contribute anything towards those £1,000. Whereas if they weren't if they were over the age of 24, or if they were 19 to 23 already with first level 2, then you'd have been asking them to make a contribution of £500 towards that £1,000. The other point to note is, you can see quite clearly, is that the ESF will fully fund anyone over 24, again up to and including the notional level 2 program, if they're unemployed. Otherwise, they're co-funded. So again, that's just a bit of clarity on something that maybe you weren't aware of. One of you has already asked me, thanks very much for the question, what's the definition of unemployed for the entitlement purposes? Well, in the guidance, the rules and performance management of the AEB, if one or more of the following apply, then the person is defined as unemployed and therefore would be entitled to be fully funded for those programs I've just described. If they're in receipt of job seekers allowance, if they're in receipt of the employment support allowance, and by the way, categorized as being in the work-related activity group, if they're in receipt of universal credit, and earn less than 16 times the national minimum wage a week, or £330 a month, and are in one of the groups work-related, work preparation, or work-focused, I think I've got that, then they would be fully funded. One thing to note though, and I know some of you working in the college sector are a bit more familiar with this, is that under the adult education budget, any provider can also use discretion to fully fund certain categories of learners. In other words, you would not require those learners to find 50% of the cost of the program. They would be learners who are in receipt of other state benefits, so it's other than JSA, ESA, Universal Credit, who again would be earning less than 16 the national minimum wage, or living wage if it applies in your area, or £330 a month. And the key thing is, therefore, they're unemployed, but they're on wider benefits, is that they are they want to be employed, and the learning is relevant to that employment. So again, if you've got someone who's not in these categories, wider benefits, they're an adult, they want to come back and do some learning to get a job, preferably with an apprenticeship, you can use a discretion to fully fund them. What qualifications count? Well, this was the old list. And again, it gives you a clear idea that the ESFA has what we call the core offer. The core offer, which is 16 up to the 23 age group, which I've just been talking about, has all those qualifications such as GCSE, GCSEs, A-levels, tech level, plus an additional number of qualifications off the RQF, as well as the English and Maths offer, which can be GCSEs, functional skills, as well as other stepping stone quals. The thing to always check is if the qualification is eligible to be funded, it will be on the hub. So I always say go to the hub, the Learning Aims Reference System service. The hub will give you up-to-date information. Do not rely on that table I've just shown you, because that's been updated all the time. The point that one of you has asked me is, well, what about those learners who are not ready to do a first level 2 or 3? Well, this year, what was introduced this year was that the SFA would fully fund anyone who was 19 to 23 if they were doing provision up to and including level 1. So it could be entry or level 1, but that would be done under local flexibility. That would also, again, apply to anyone who's 24 and over. So again, when you've got an access to employment issue and you've got someone who's struggling to do first level 2, but would really need to get some provision at level 1 or at entry level, then you can use the adult education budget to do that. It's part of the local flexibility, and it could actually be commissioned at local level. But then what you're saying is that we'd have to see evidence that those people did progress to a higher level qual, such as level 2, and ultimately, if the primary motive for doing that was to get employment, we'd want to see progression to employment. And I know we've got one colleague who's telling us that in fact they've got very high rates of conversion, which I think is great. You know, if you can get a quarter of all your adult learners on any of these programs, such as the employability programs, to actually get into employment, and then a proportion of those into apprenticeships, you're doing really well. So here is the sort of table that sums up for 17-18. Who would be fully funded, who would be co-funded, and remember, co-funding means that a proportion of your AEB is not being used up as AEB, but you're actually adding to your AEB allocation or contract value with whatever the fee is you collect off the learner or the sponsor. So there's a wee bit of a summary, but you can see that now if you go down to the third one down, learning to progress to level 2, fully funded up to and including level 1, so it includes level 1, and they're fully funded if they're 19 to 23 or if they're over the age of 24 and unemployed. But that must be delivered as a part of what I'd call your flexible delivery, and clearly the amount that you're delivering there as a proportion of your contract or your allocation will be determined by what local demand is, particularly if the LEP's identifying there's quite a lot of people who need training and education at level entry and level 1 to be able to get into employment and into obviously hopefully an apprenticeship. So again, and I know that one of you has already said, well, is it necessary into an apprenticeship? Well, don't forget, some people will get an apprenticeship even though the job isn't defined as being permanent, but once they complete the apprenticeship, they will often then secure the job. Others will go into a job, the apprenticeship is then delivered at either the same time or later than their actual entry into that job. But there's other groups of people, such as, for example, those learners who are already in jobs, but maybe they haven't had the necessary, if you want, encouragement of achieving a level 2 or an English and Maths qualification that would maybe allow them to access an apprenticeship at a higher level. So the key message from today is the AEB can meet these different types of needs. What is the need of the person who's seeking work? What about the person that's in work but wanting to improve their skills? And how do we sell the benefits of that to employers? So, for example, one of the things that we've certainly found successful with us is we offer a lot of employers English and Maths for the staff. So the staff are fully funded if they do English and Maths. They obviously come to us or they do it by distance. Key thing about that is that often then says to the employer, well, now that those learners of those members of our staff have improved their English and Maths skills, what about upskilling them in the vocational area? And in that case then, for what you're doing then is offering them apprenticeships. But remember, the barrier to the apprenticeship was very often the poor levels of English and Maths. So a good point there, thanks for that. Okay, so what is the actual formula that we apply to any adult funded by the adult education budget? Now, it's quite an important sort of issue, this, but before we just do that, we've got a question from Reese, where funding is used for a broader range of activities, for example, non-qualification. What proportion of activities should a provider be targeting? I think the answer to this question is very much is down to what is what you've identified at local level. That's why, where, for example, you'll find that the local LEP or the commissioning agency, by the time you get into local devolution, but they might already be indicating that through devolved planning, is that we might want, for example, 600 people in the next year in Sheffield City region, for example, I'm just making this up, it could be an example, to do an ESOL, non-qualification bearing, particularly because of the needs of the migrant population there. And of those, we'd expect a proportion then to progress to a qualification in ESOL, which might be, you know, at entry level or whatever. So I think it's down, Reese, very much to what you can identify as being a local demand, particularly where it fits with an agenda that the LEP might have or a combined authority might have, or particular actions might have, for example, if it's targeted under European Social Fund, where it might be, for example, working with young people or working with those who need access to the world of work. So I think it's got to be proportionate to what your experience is in the past. You can't suddenly change everything from non-qualification to qualification or vice versa, but it should be very much driven by local demand. And once you've got that, then this is genuinely a demand-led approach to funding. So I think it should be something that's reasonable, where you can show that there would be some opportunities to progress from the non-qualification, but also depends on your past history, particularly if you're a community learning provider, where a lot of your provision might have been non-formula funded in the past, where you might have used other indicators such as commitment to learn, the number of hours that the program took, for example, is just as good. Can a self-employed learner aged 19 to 24 without first level 2 be eligible? They've got to be eligible using one of the definitions that I showed you there: receipt of JSA, ESA, universal credit, and if they're earning less than 16 times the national minimum wage, or £330 a month, then clearly if they've got a little job, that means that they haven't got that earning and they're therefore receiving universal credit, or you'd apply the wider benefit to them. I think that can apply, but essentially we're looking at people who are registered unemployed using one of those definitions I talked about. But again, you can find people on universal credit where it's being applied that will be in that category if it's less than £330 a month. Generally, you've got to look at each specific case and get clarity on that. I think in terms of the way that the funding works, the funding for each, and here we've got a difference, because if you're looking at the adult education budget, you know, we fund an apprentice in a holistic way. It's the whole of the experience, including obviously that English and Maths that they do. Whereas if you look at adult education, we fund the individual qualification that the learner does. So the funding is not for the learner, the funding is for each qualification or each learning program, which might not necessarily be a qualification, which the learner does. And therefore, the rate, which comes out of a matrix, which is on the, I'll show you in a minute, then applies to that learner. Now, that will often be driven by the number of hours or the size of the qualification according to the awarding body, or the total qualification hours. We then apply a weighting per hour to indicate, for example, that business studies is cheaper per hour to deliver than, say, sport, which is cheaper per hour than to deliver construction or music. And then we apply individual characteristics such as which postal code does the learner come from. And remember, 27% of the poorest postal codes earn an uplift. That can be anywhere between 8.4% you add to the value of the learning aim, or up to 33.6. And then you apply another cost factor to this, which reflects how much the costs are of delivering, where, for example, in London and the Southeast, those costs are higher. Remember, the delivery location is based either on the head office or that point at which the delivery occurs. So if your point of delivery is in central London and your head office is in central London, then we could be applying a 20% uplift to the value of each qualification that we showed you there. Now, how do those qualifications get valued? Well, anything that you ran last year will have the same rate of funding this year. So that's continuation, right? That's the way that guarantees that you've very much got the same level of funding. But I think what is critical here is also that for anything that you're introducing that's new, we either use the regulated guided learning hours that comes from the awarding body, the total qualification time, which can include study time and assessment time, or the planned hours, which come through particularly if it's a non-qualification activity, through the single activity matrix, which we'll show you in a minute, and that will then give you a funding rate. I think one of the things that's also coming through, by the way, generally as an issue here, is that when we start talking about the adult education budget, it is often very much more to do with what's happening in the local area, and therefore, although we have a national formula that applies, it can, of course, be affected by, in terms of the demand, from what might be the demands of the LEP, the combined authority, but certainly from the point that one of you has already made, it's likely to be a much more collaborative model, which also relates to one of the previous questions about the proportion that might be non-qualification bearing activity. We can also use the SAM, the single activity matrix, for very small provision. So again, you might be saying, well, look, I might run some of this under the community learning and get the person in to do maybe a small 12-hour award or something where you can use a unit, and as long as it's on the hub, and then that's getting the person into learning, and then we can maybe then use that to build up their confidence and go into bigger qualifications. So you'll see in a minute how SAM can apply. The one thing that's not changed, although it did change in the last year, is that the index of multiple deprivation, which we used to work out disadvantage uplift based on postal code, is now the 2015 one. The other thing to note is, unlike young people who are funded on numbers, and if anyone isn't retained, you lose 50% of funding. There's no achievement funding with young people. For adults, it's 80% on retention, that's by the month, so it's the program funding, and 20% on achievement of the learning aim, which can be a non-qualification, a qualification, employment, or an apprenticeship if you're looking at things like traineeships. For anyone who's not fully funded, we assume 50% of the unweighted rate is what we're going to set as a contribution from them or the sponsor. So those things have not changed. The other point to note clearly is that any individual learner who's disclosed and you've assessed that they've got an individual learning support need, you can claim through the ILR £150 per month for that learner for as many months as that support is being provided. If, by the way, you do not find that's enough, then you can obviously, through a cost model, in other words, keep evidence of the cost, claim more than £150, but you don't do that through the ILR. Your management information team will tell you how to do that through a thing called the earnings adjustment statement. So all the component parts of funding for 17-18 are very similar to what you've had in the current year. So this is now in the single activity matrix. So you can identify from the funding band hours what type of activity it is. So for example, if I'm running a 90-hour IT course, that would be medium provision 2. IT is weighted at B, 1.12, and therefore if that learner was fully funded, it'd be £504 that I would be claiming if they were retained, that's 80% of the funding, and if they achieve the IT qualification, I would be gaining that. Together, the 80 and 20 would give me £504. That's before I knew what the learner's postal code, or before I knew whether delivery was in London or not. And you can see how it works. The weightings: A, business, a lot of GCSEs and A-levels; B, education, sport, health and social care; C, catering, creative, construction, engineering; D, some aspects of construction engineering, music, technology. D would also be land-based subjects such as agriculture, horticulture, done in a general environment. And E would be land-based activities in a specialist environment. So you'd be a land-based provider, such as like an agricultural college. For those qualifications which have got values that are regulated by the awarding bodies such as A-levels, GCSEs, the functional skills, access to HE, here are the values that apply next year. And again, the different weightings reflect that. One thing to note, by the way, is that GCSE English and Maths are not funded at £724. They're funded at £811. And this is to get you to start thinking about English and Maths GCSEs as a particularly good offer to make to adults. It's £811. And functional skills in Maths, by the way, you also see there's a medium value at 941. Functional skills are normally funded at 724. But if you're doing entry-level Maths, doesn't matter if it's entry 1, 2 or 3, it's £941. And there's an incentive to reflect that very often at entry-level Maths is quite difficult to do in big groups, and therefore you might be able to generate a viable group size at £941 that you wouldn't be able at 724. So again, those of you planning to use the AEB to work with, for example, unemployed learners through employability programs where you have access to them long enough to do the functional skills or the GCSEs in English and Maths, then you can see how that's quite an attractive offer. If you build an English Maths GCSE, £811. If they're doing GCSE English at 811 and entry level Maths at 941, you know, you've almost got £1,800 worth of resource there to get that person up to the level of English and Maths that might get them into a job, and preferably into a job with an apprenticeship. And if they've already done their English and Maths at level 2, i.e. they've got a grade 4, then obviously it's going to be easier for them to complete the apprenticeship because they won't also be using time doing English or Maths. So again, I think we found, certainly at Learning Curve, the English and Maths route into apprenticeships, but often that's an obstacle for both people who are out of work and those at work who might not be able to benefit from an apprenticeship because they've got issues with literacy and numeracy. Quite a useful route in. So there's some general questions. I know you're coming to me in terms of the way the funding model works, but just before we move on, is everyone quite comfortable with the funding model? Thanks for the questions that have been posted. Thanks very much so far. That's great. The other thing to note, by the way, is that in terms of the earning, the methodology of 80% retention, 20% achievement done by month is no different from what we've done in the past. Clearly, you can see there that what happens if a person starts a program and then, for example, doesn't complete the qual but gets a job. If we're talking about unemployed people whose primary thing was to come in and do learning with you that was relevant to getting a job, and if they then go on to a job and that job is one which meets the criteria for sustainability, then you might be able to claim half the achievement. Even though they haven't achieved the funding, the qualification, you know, which would have got you 20% funding, you can still claim half the achievement funding if you've got evidence they've moved into a job that's sustained. Now, we did ask how many of you were doing traineeships, and I think from the responses we got were 1 or 2 of you have tried it, it didn't work. Some are still persevering, others have not tried it at all. It is one of the priority areas that's been identified nationally and at local level through the LEPs. My disappointment with traineeships is that I don't think traineeships have been well enough thought through and planned to actually do the re-engagement that we want with, for example, long-term unemployed learners and the employers that you want to match them with. And I think the reason being is sometimes the gap between the learner's expectations and characteristics and capabilities are too big for the actual traineeship to close them, because you've only got the learner between 6 and 26 weeks, you know, 6 weeks to 6 months. and that might not be long enough, in which case you might have to think of different programs. I think essentially the criteria have got to be that any adult that you're looking at, particularly if they're 19 to 24, or a 16 to 18-year-old, because they can be funded through the AEB, is to make sure that in effect they have got the motivation, they have got the confidence, but they're just missing that finishing touch, and I think that'll work better. And certainly from one of your experiences, you've told me in the preamble to this that you'd taken on people long-term unemployed from Job Centre Plus. It hadn't worked. I think it's because that gap is too big. This is much more of a finishing touch, and therefore you might need a sort of pre-traineeship program before a traineeship. Traineeship to me is like a finishing touch, and I think that's the way to look at it. It's going to be tailor-made to meet the individual needs. But the key thing here is, and this is where we're not getting the outcomes, you know, the proportion of people on traineeships actually progressing to apprenticeships is very low nationally. It is disappointing. But I think the emphasis has got to be on employment first. And certainly from speaking to one of you before, you said that was your focus. Let's get them into employment. If we can then get, if the apprenticeship comes, then wonderful. But you're only working with partners who already have apprenticeship contracts. Well, if you're working with partners, for example, if you're a prime and you're subcontracting them, then you will certainly find that if you're subcontracting them to a partner who's already doing apprenticeships, you're going to have a much better progression rate. It's easier that way. Alison and Andy, you've said that traineeships are a very small provision, no adults, no referrals from Job Centre Plus, but you have good placements available. I mean, I tend to avoid, referrals. I tend to say, let's identify our own learners that maybe need a finishing touch, and we focus on them first, or we have carefully tailored discussions with the employer and then go out and recruit the learners. But I think the key thing here is that integration of good quality information, advice and guidance. If you get that wrong, you're not going to get the right match. You've got to then have got solid support for those learners, particularly when in the work placement, and full engagement with the employer. And as Alison and Andy said, it can be disappointing even when you've got great placements if you've got the wrong people or not enough people. I think there is generally still a problem. The public perception of traineeships is less than positive. You know, we've often heard this expression of cheap labour, or just, as one person described to me, lower class internships. Didn't know what that meant, but you can see what the sentiment was. They are fully funded up to the age of 24, but I think for me, it is the effective engagement with a prospective employer, because they have to provide the work placement. And if the person completes the traineeship, they've also got to offer them an exit interview or a formal interview where a vacancy exists. So one bit of advice is only work with employers where the vacancies actually exist. And I think that's a particular tactic that colleagues at WNC are doing, where your employability programs tend to support employer vacancies. So you're bound to get, I think, much better progression to employment by working in that way. Just a hint, but it's a good thing to note, which another provider is using. So underpinning traineeships for me is this matching process between what are the needs of the employer in terms of the skill sets they're looking for. So I think that's the sort of key thing for me. What is the employer looking for here? What is the learner's capabilities in terms of motivation? They've got to be unemployed or less than so many hours a week work if they've got jobs, but essentially they're needing that finishing touch, you know, to get them in. They've got to have the motivation. You then make sure you're the right provider to do it. In other words, have you got the connection with the employer? Have you got the connection with the learner? And then the last thing you do is sort out the program. And the program has got to be individual to that learner, the right length. And again, what one of you has told me is that your AEB tends to be done on a sort of almost like a year plan from September through to the next August. What happens if the labour market wants to take on labour at different points, which it might do. Every month there might be an access point to jobs, for example, in the retail sector. The problem is here is that if your programs are all very much that longitudinal, planned that way, you haven't got enough stepping off points into the labour market. Traineeships can do that for you. But of course they are a lot more hassle, if you want, in terms of making sure that you've got that match in place. So how are they funded? Through the adult education budget, but you can extend this to include 16 to 18-year-old trainees. So in other words, if you haven't got a contract to work with 16 to 18-year-olds, what was traditionally DFA, but have got a contract with the to do adult education budget, you can include in your traineeship offer 16 to 18-year-olds which I know one of you has already said to me, thanks very much, at the point there, a comment, adults often have much better rates of success with than if you're working with adults. For adults, each qualification is separately funded. The work experience and work preparation, there is no separate funding for work prep quals. They're funded at £970. The work experience must be a minimum of 100 hours. I think we're seeing sort of around 200 to 240 hours being quite a norm. And it must have qualifications such as English and maths or any flexible qualifications, which might be vocational, which are approved for 19-year-olds. If, by the way, you're offering programs to 16 to 18-year-old trainees, check on the hub that the quals you're offering them are eligible for young people, because often there's different rules there. The earnings methodology applies, 80% on retention, 20% on achievement for all elements. So for example, if they're doing English, 80% of the funding is retention, 20% is achievement. If they're doing, for example, a level 1 award in horticulture, 80% retention, 20% achievement. On the work experience bit, the £970, 80% retention by number of months or weeks they're on the program on doing a work placement, and 20% on either moving on to employment, moving on to apprenticeship, or moving on to further study. And you can see those outcomes defined at the bottom of that page. The learners can also access learning support, learner support, and in some cases with disabilities, access to work funding. So can you make sure that you see how all of these rules fit in terms of the outcomes? One of you's already said what the outcomes that are measured in terms of traineeships, they're those below. In terms of the localization agenda, they're actually seen as a significant priority, not only at national level, but local level. And again, this is coming back to what Gordon said about working in a strategic partnership with your local authority, the LEP, etc. Very often, they will want to commission groups of people coming together. So this could be, for example, a partner that's good at bringing people who are some distance from the learning, together with a good supplier of the actual learning program, with a good, for example, employer base, which could be the local authority and its subcontract and its supply chain, and then putting together a coherent offer at that regional or sub-regional level. It is seen as a key element in the development of apprenticeship activity, and this is disappointing because actually, if you, as I said earlier, the national figures show not very good progression from apprenticeship, from traineeships to apprenticeships. So something is going wrong, and usually it's the bit about not having had the employer actually commit to saying, this is part of my recruitment strategy, you're helping me with that. I think with greater devolution of adult education budget, there will be therefore much more emphasis, I think, on those traineeships being much more closely linked to things like inward investment, etc. It was, by the way, a key feature of the AEB procurement exercise. Those of you who are not primes, who are not directly funded were not directly funded by the SFA, maybe as subcontractors. If you were going forward on the procurement exercise, which was occurring at the turn of the year, then you would have found that one of the key messages there was employability, skills, English and maths, as well as traineeships. And it's likely those local outcome agreements that we'll see increasingly from 2018-19 will feature much more on traineeships. So here's an example of a 19 to 24 trainee. You can see that the work placement is almost half of the whole program. They're doing a little level 1 award in CV writing, which is seen as work preparation. There's no separate funding for that. The two are put together, £970. They're doing English and maths functional skills, £724. You can tell that the maths is not at entry level, because if it was at entry level, that would have been £941. There's a little technical certificate that this person's doing. It could be something like horticulture or something like that. It could be welding or something like that, 96 hours. And those are all coming off the matrix or of the value of the individual qualification of the hub. So you can see that that adult, if they were successfully retained to the end, or successfully moved on to employment, or successfully moved on to the apprenticeship, we'd be generating £3,000, which I think, you know, for 440 hours, it's working at about £7 per hour. You can work out what would be a viable group size, etc. But more importantly, there is progression. So that's a good, just a question, by the way, from one of you has posed, what was the procurement process? This was not applied to colleges unless colleges were going for some growth. But basically, last October, we were informed, because we're an independent training provider, the fact that we would have to go through a procurement process. I know many of the others would have. And obviously that meant that a proportion of the adult education budget was then going to be subject to some kind of procurement process, open only to those of us who were on the ROTO and had passed capability and capacity. Now this would apply to any new contracts from the 1st of August. In other words, we know that our contracts would run out at the end of July, and therefore we'd have to go through this process. Now, the minimum funding was going to be about £110 million. We can guess more than likely that we've exceeded that. The minimum contract value was going to be 100,000. Of course, we're in now a bit of a limbo because, or a bit of state of suspension, because obviously with the postponement of the non-levy paying employer procurement exercise and some kind of temporary situation being established there, which many of us are not pleased with, we've got slightly concerns about this. But the priorities that were identified very often in this is for us as independent providers or as colleges seeking growth, would be 19 to 24 traineeships, English and maths, skills provision those unemployed and live in one of the priority disadvantage areas, and that was quite critical, as well as the delivery of technical programs for adults aged 19 to 23, and that was mostly first level 2, first level 3. You can see the priorities coming through this, and you can see predominantly fully funded provision. So we need to demonstrate our readiness, we have to have a proven track record, we need to have awareness of what was going on in the local area, we have to have a good delivery plan, and obviously any of us that had any problems with Ofsted in terms of leadership and management or overall effectiveness would be excluded. So we're now waiting for our results. But of course, everything is likely to have been affected by this called the election. So I think we're going to have some issues here, because we certainly would want to know when these contracts are going to be reissued. The same exercise obviously will as applied for, or similar exercise applied for procurement of non-levy paying apprenticeships. The other concern, of course, is that you can use the AEB for any one of those things. Yeah, from ESO, one of the good questions about, can you use AEB for a credit online? Of course you can. The method of learning is not an issue here, as long as you can evidence through an audit trail, through activity, through things like online enrollment, through things like logging on and logging off, that learning took place. And that's why if you look at the definitions of what is total qualification time or guided learning, you'll see as long as there's evidence that that online learning has been supported by tutors, by good quality materials, then clearly you will satisfy audit requirements. So there are implications of this whole process, and I think just be aware that obviously the big concern from the independent training provider sector was why only us and not why everyone, and that's still going to be an issue in future. In terms of devolution, watch out for this, because obviously in terms of the ability of any of you to plan your AEB beyond, say, 17-18, you're going to be very much what you've got to factor in is, well, the results of the election, clearly what happens with Brexit, but also how far will devolution go? And obviously today we're appointing some of those devolved, voting for those devolved mayors, for example. I think the budget that will be predominantly devolved is the adult education budget, and with it the matched ESIF budgets, in particular here the European Social Fund budgets, which I think will be a key aspect of these future decisions. So this will be much more of a local service to meet local needs, and of course that means you have to really align yourself. Now that's not too much a problem if you are based in only one LEP. If you're national providers like us, we operate across 39 LEPs, so we have to plug in to 39 local and possibly more if the combined authorities, or if devolution occurs to smaller agencies, then we have to work in some kind of system through all of those. In the first place, the ESFA and the LEPs will work together, but eventually I can see that the LEPs and the combined authorities will take on much more of this responsibility. A key focus of every one of those localized deals is employer engagement, progression to employment, and to apprenticeships. So the AEB will be predominantly looked at as how has it helped educational needs in the area, engagement with the community, English, maths, etc. And secondly, how has it met the needs for employment, and particularly how has it helped to deliver apprenticeship and the growth in apprenticeships in that area. And those will be conditions. So you can see that in future, where you might say, well, our AEB is not particularly fed into employment. It's been a bit ad hoc. We haven't done it on a planned basis, which is reality for a lot of us. You're going to say, well, wait a minute, we're going to have to plan progression a little bit more. Why? Because that's going to be one of our key ways of getting the commission. In other words, if we can't indicate that we're activating people into employment and into apprenticeships and we're not strong in terms of that, then you might not be commissioned in the first place. So there are some more pressures on us to focus on that, and that means going back to some of those questions that were posed around traineeships, which is, have you got the employer? Have you engaged the employer first? Now, are you activating people into jobs where there's vacancies? And those at work, how are we activating within the employer and within the learner, and need to do maybe an apprenticeship or to do a higher apprenticeship if they've already got one. So that, I think, can be quite key messages here. So those, what's going to be the characteristics, therefore, of the future of the funding of adults? I think increased localism and devolution, I've already said. A much closer link between how the adult education budget is being used and economic and social policy. So what's in the skills plan nationally? What's in our industrial strategy? Where is the upskilling going to be needed? How can we show that we are supporting employer vacancies? Are we working with the right partners that are going to get us, those people, into employment and into apprenticeships? I think that responsiveness to different market needs and wants is critical. That's why community learning has still got an important role. That's why non-accredited learning, because different markets, different stages, different needs. There's educational needs as well as obviously labour market needs. I think this will force some of us out of the market because we just can't meet their needs. We won't be big enough. Others might come into the market who might not have thought about this before because there were subcontractors, for example, and they go through the procurement exercise, or because we've got some providers that want to diversify into other types of funding. I think that shift in funding away from the state increasing to beneficiaries is also critical. You know, we've seen that with employers, with the levy. We're seeing it with loan-funded learners at level 3. I mean, one of the things I would say is, how much progression do you have from your AEB into level 3 provision, which is loan-funded? You know, in other words, people who are not using their entitlements. I think what's going to be critical here, and I think one or two of you have already highlighted, is that whatever investment you do procure or get commissioned as adult education budget is increasingly focuses on outcomes. How many of those adults have progressed to the next level or to bigger types of learning? How many have progressed, for example, through learning into English and maths? And what's happened to their destinations in terms of employment, but also in terms of the differences in earnings? And I think that's why I can see a strong link between the future performance management of AEB and progression to employment and to apprenticeships, because that's where the earning changes occur. Skills acquisition, promotion, etc. And I think value for money in all those arrangements. So my conclusion, and you know, as an organisation at Learning Curve and working with our partners, we are increasingly feeding much more of our thinking in terms of all of those different funding streams. You know, the accredited, non-accredited, the adult community learning, the classroom-based activity with adults, and saying how many of those can be then going into employment, how many will go into an apprenticeship to secure the job, how many will get a job with an apprenticeship, how many who are already apprentices might want to progress to other forms of learning. And I think that means effective use of the English and Maths entitlements, the first level 2, first level 3, using traineeships right across the piece from 16 up to 24. All of these can help increase employability skills of learners. I think that will prepare them more effectively for employment apprenticeships, but also it gives you the opportunity, like we have done through doing English and Maths and distance learning with employers, which in many cases being fully funded. I don't mean publicly funded, full cost funding, you know, to pay for it in full, has actually strengthened our engagement with employers. So I think you can see that what comes first might be the engagement with employers. Certainly what comes first there is the engagement with the learners. And I think local devolution of AEB will also require a more focused approach to progression into employment with apprenticeships, because that will be increasing a condition if you're getting the funding. If I'm going to commission you and it's ESOL, then I'm going to say, well, how many of those ESOL learners which I might commission initially to be non-accredited, will move on to accredited programs. How many of those accredited programs will then go and do functional skills in English? How many of those will then get a job? How many of those will get a job will go into apprenticeships? So you can see how those conditions will be increasing their feature of, and that's all got to feed into the industrial strategy and the skills plan. So those were the 3 questions that we posed. So you might now, in the light of this afternoon's webinar, and in light of some of the questions that you've posed, you might have to go back to those 3 questions and maybe start looking at them again and what you're intending to do in 17-18. And if you're also finding that you have to go and work with maybe other people in your organisation to get them to look at the AEB allocation, and if not got AEB allocation, maybe to go through a procurement exercise in future, certainly to get onto the register. If you're a subcontractor, clearly you want to make sure that you're working with a directly funded organisation that was a clarity of how it wants to use its subcontracting. And if you haven't previously thought of subcontracting, but you've got value to add, then it might be useful to have a chat with one of the providers that you know is getting directly funded, who would benefit from maybe your ability to access difficult to reach learners, or your ability to engage effectively with employers. Remember, whatever you do in the partnership that you can add value to the partnership in terms of learner progress and outcomes will be seen as critical. It's like us, we like to work with high quality partners, you know, whatever part of that journey, the learner journey, they can contribute value to. So thanks very much for the questions. Hopefully we've answered them. I will go back and just check one question which I know that Paul posed about the rights of people who are self-employed to access fully funded provision. So I'll just check on that just to make sure that was correct, and if there's any difference I'll come back to you on that. Any other questions or comments, Marek?
Have I missed any questions from you? I think we covered them all, but any final questions or thoughts from participants? Thank you very much as well, Beej, for another fantastic session. Let's have a look. There's just 1 or 2.
Oh, by the way, I've just thought about the question that Paul posed. Sorry, Mike.
Okay.
Can you please tell me whether a self-employed learner aged 19 to 23 without a first level 2, it makes no difference whether they're employed or self-employed or anything. Anyone who individually, as long as it's not done through the workplace, individually, anyone who wishes to undertake a first level 2 that's never taken it before is fully funded. They are eligible. So that's the answer. As long as it's 19 to 23. If it's 24 and over, they must be unemployed, and therefore they would have had to meet those conditions. So in answer to the question, Paul, if they were 19 to 23 and they've never done a first level 2 before, they're fully funded. That means they're eligible to undertake the program. They wouldn't have to pay anything towards it, as long as they're 19 to 23. If they're 24 and over, then you would be looking at, they'd have to meet one of the criteria for unemployment, which is what I think I originally said. So just a bit of clarity on that. Thanks, Paul. Okay, Marek, any other questions?
I just popped you through another one from Liam. I think I've forwarded it through to yourself. There's just another one that had come through via Ian as well.
I think there was one question from Andy Doran. If the job outcome brings half of the achievement funding, is this counted as an achiever for the qualification achievement rates? I'd have to just check on that. No, because they haven't achieved the qualification in full. And you know you get half the funding, but would you have achieved the qualification? The answer is no, but I'll have a look at that. Align the plans with introduction of, can we use, I've looked at that question. So I'll just check on Andy Doran's question about the, is this counted as achiever for qualification achievement rates? No, because you haven't achieved the qualification. It's just that you get half the funding. Let me just have a look. Can you use AEB for on-site? Liam, can you use AEB for on-site NVQs? No, the adult education budget cannot be used to fund work-based learning other than when it's for the entitlements. So that was introduced in the current year. It's not 17-18, it was 16-17 it was introduced. Basically what they're saying is any work-based learning will not be funded by the AEB if it's done on the premises of the employer and it's done in work's time. That should really be an apprenticeship. So I think the difficulty there is the only exceptions to that would be if there was a locally agreed exception, because that might be a key skill area where there might be a shortage of skills in that area, or whether it was under, the flexibility rules. So you could, it'd have to be very much agreed that was either a first level 2 or a first level 3, which it might not be, or it was agreed under the flexibility, but that would have to be something which would be, you'd have to be able to say, look, the reason that I've been able to get that funded through the AEB is because we have a local agreement that is a particular shortage of skill in that area. So I think you were using it for OSAT provision, weren't you? I'd have to check on that, but it could be access AEB for OSAT provision. I'd have to look at that. But I think one of the key things is that, Liam, is that generally the rule is no, and if you look through the guidance, the rules and performance management of adult education budget, you'll see it quite clearly. But there are 1 or 2 exceptions. It's where that person's entitlement is the first level 2 or first level 3, 19 to 23, or whether it's done under some flexibility, which means it has to be specifically an exception. It meets a particular skill shortage in that area. So it's worth having a look at whether that would meet any of the criteria. But generally, this was a change that we were worried about. Traineeships and the QAR are by separate learning aim, the achievement funding by the Z program. Yeah, if you look in the traineeships, it's each separate learning aim. So if you get your English, that counts 1. Maths, that counts 2. If you did a flexible qualification like a little level 1 certificate, that would be 3. And then the Z program, which is the work placement, the achievement funding there, that's the 20%, is earned either by progress to further education or training, progress to employment, progress to apprenticeship. As I said in those, in that slide on traineeships, which if I can go back, man, I can just show. Yeah, that defined the statement. So that would be you would have those 3 things there. Progression to one of the 3 outcomes depends on apprenticeship, sustainable employment, and of course, more recently, further study. Remember, further study didn't apply originally to adults, but only applied to young people. So it's anything that appears as an achievement in the performance tables. Good questions. Excellent questions. Thank you very much, then. Thanks very much, everyone.
Right, super. Yeah, I think there's just one more there, is there? Let's see.
No, I think from Liam, what I'm saying is if I get a job, it will only count as achievement for the actual Z bit of the program, which is the £970, which is my work placement, which will depend on the number of hours I've put in, right? But it's £970 anyway. It's
right.
£970.
No problem at all. I think there was just another one from ESU, but I think you could perhaps cover that off.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
But I will lose the achievement funding for any of the other component parts if they haven't been completed. Now that's one of the big issues, because very often a person gets a job before the end of the traineeship, and yet although they've got a positive outcome, we don't get all the achievement funding. That's right. It's one of the issues that applies when you've got a funding by individual qualification. What was the next? Was there another one from Isu?
Yes. Traineeships just pops up that I can. Let me just have a.
From Isu.
Have you found?
We have a learner on a traineeship who's not got her English and maths, but got 100 hours of placement and vocational element. She's been offered an apprenticeship. What would be best? Withdraw on a traineeship and start an apprenticeship. Well, obviously, an apprenticeship's going to bring you a lot more funding if you're only just doing 100 hours of placement plus English and maths, depending on how many hours you're giving English and maths. But they would only be 724. So you'd be getting 970 plus. You'd be getting about £2,500. Depends on the apprenticeship. I think one of the things I would say is, does she need the traineeship before she can successfully complete the apprenticeship? And of course, what you can do with the traineeship is say put the English and maths end dates so they're later than the completion of the traineeship, and then she completes those on the apprenticeship, which obviously are funded it separately. You see, the funding for English and maths and apprenticeship is only £471 for English and £471 for maths. You get more if they're doing it on a traineeship. The problem here is, of course, is that she's been offered an apprenticeship, and that means a job. So, you know, from her point of view, I would say get her into the job, and then obviously complete the English and maths on the apprenticeship. It depends on what apprenticeship. If it's in business admin, might only be a £2,000 to £3,000 apprenticeship. So it's much more about the learner and her individual progress than the value that's attached to them in that case. Whereas obviously if she was going on to something like an engineering apprenticeship, £27,000, I would certainly move her on to the apprenticeship as quickly as possible. Okay, can we close the recording down? Because any of these other questions that come in, we don't necessarily want to record the answers for everyone.
Exactly, no problem at all. But again, thank you very much for everyone's some really good questions. I think we anticipated some good questions for this one, haven't we, Beej?
Yeah, good questions and good comments as well. Thanks very much.
Exactly, and you delivered. So I'll be providing you all with a copy of the video recording and the slides as well, and obviously you'll have our contact details should you wish to get in touch with us. If you're watching this on the recording as well, just want to make sure that you all know that next week we're actually running an event which is going to be looking at the new T-levels. The webinar is going to be called T-levels, Getting Ready for 2019. And it's going to be taking place next Thursday at 11 o'clock, but I'll make sure you all get an invite along with the registration links as well. Well, thank you very much, Beej.